The German intelligence file was stamped with 3 words: Feindliche Täuschungsmanöver, enemy deception operation. It was found on December 21, 1944, inside an abandoned Wehrmacht command post on the eastern bank of the Saar River, its pages still warm from a stove that the retreating officers hadn't had time to fully burn. The file contained a psychological profile of General George S. Patton Jr., compiled by Army Group G's Intelligence Division at the direct request of General Hermann Balck, the decorated panzer commander who had just assumed control of German forces in the sector. Before you hear what's in that file, read these numbers. On December 4, 1944, the garrison defending Saarlorten, a fortified industrial rail junction whose bridges could shorten the war or extend it by a season, numbered over 600 combat-hardened German troops, reinforced by elements of the 416th Infantry Division. The American force tasked with taking it, fewer than 200 men from Baker Company and attached elements of the 357th Infantry Regiment, 90th Infantry Division, 3-to-1 odds inside a city that had been engineered to be held forever. Balck's intelligence assessment called Patton a glory hunter who sacrifices his men for newspaper headlines. It predicted that American morale would collapse under sustained urban combat. It predicted that American officers, trained to follow plans rather than think, would freeze when those plans fell apart. What actually happened in Saarlorten between December 4 and December 8, 1944, 4 days that Balck's own staff would later describe as incomprehensible, is the answer to a question his analysts never thought to ask. What if they were wrong about everything? Part 1: The weight of the mission. December 1944. The war in Europe had reached the moment that armchair strategists in London called the final push, a phrase that meant almost nothing to the men who had to make it real in mud and ice and blood. By the first week of December, Patton's Third Army had been grinding through the Lorraine region of northeastern France since August, 4 months of near-continuous combat that had consumed more fuel, more ammunition, and more lives than any operational plan had projected. The winter was arriving with a cruelty that the meteorologists had underestimated and the Germans had not. Temperature at the front, 17 degrees Fahrenheit. In some units, frostbite casualties were now exceeding combat casualties by a factor of 2, but the strategic picture was shifting in ways that mattered. If Patton's XII Corps, commanded by General Manton Eddy, operating under the broader umbrella of 12th Army Group, could force a crossing of the Saar River and seize the industrial rail junction at Saarlorten, it would tear a 40-mile gap in the West Wall, the layered German defensive network that Hitler had declared impenetrable since its reconstruction in 1944. Saarlorten was not simply a city, it was a lock on a door. Behind that door, the Rhineland. Beyond the Rhineland, the war's end. Captain James Malone, 28 years old, from Abilene, Kansas, understood exactly what the city meant. He had been studying it since November 26, when the operations order landed on his folding table in a frozen farmhouse outside Bouzenville, France. Malone commanded Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 357th Infantry Regiment. He had led men into Cherbourg through the hedgerow nightmare of the Bocage and across the Moselle under direct fire in September. He had been awarded the Silver Star for actions his men described, without embellishment, as "the captain didn't stop moving." What his men knew and what headquarters did not was this: Malone carried in his left breast pocket a photograph of his daughter Elena, 18 months old, whom he had never held. Elena had been born September 3, 1943, the same day the British landed at Reggio di Calabria, while Malone was already in England, already training for what was coming. He had looked at her photograph every morning since the unit crossed into France. He looked at it the morning of December 4, then folded it behind his field order and got to work. His key soldiers, Staff Sergeant Dominic Caruso, 24, from Brooklyn, New York, an NCO who knew his men's boot sizes and their mothers' names with equal precision. Private First Class Luther Webb, 21, from Selma, Alabama, the company's finest scout, a man who moved through terrain like he had grown out of it. Corporal Francis Fitzgerald, 26, from South Boston, the radio operator who could coax a signal out of a SCR-300 in conditions that would have made the equipment's engineers weep. The plan, as Colonel George Bath's headquarters had designed it, was sequential and seemingly clean. Baker Company would cross the Saar at Pont de Saar using a rubber assault boat crossing point that a French resistance contact, identified only as Marcel, had confirmed was unobserved by German sentries. Once across, they would advance 3 blocks northeast to the Saarlaufen rail depot, neutralize the garrison that Marcel had estimated at no more than 200, perhaps fewer, and hold the facility until armor from the 735th Tank Battalion could cross in support. The flaw in the plan, Marcel's estimate was 17 days old. In those 17 days, elements of the German 416th Infantry Division had rotated into Saarlaufen, nearly tripling the garrison's combat strength. That update existed at XII Corps headquarters, buried in a signals intercept summary dated November 30th, not yet distributed to regimental level. Malone did not know this. He would cross the Saar at 4:30 on December 4th with 187 men, trusting a plan built on numbers that were already ghosts. Across the river, in a commandeered apartment building converted into a makeshift command post, Hauptmann Werner Schreiber, 34 years old, veteran of the Eastern Front campaigns of 1941 and 1942, now commanding the Saarlaufen garrison, received a forward outpost report at 4:45. Americans on the water, approximately 200. Schreiber read the report and, by the account of his adjutant Lieutenant Klaus Vormann, laughed. Schreiber said, "Patton sends us a gift. He needs a headline," Vormann wrote in a post-war deposition filed with the U.S. Army's Historical Division in 1946. "We will give him a defeat." Schreiber did not reinforce his riverbank positions. He pulled his men back 2 blocks into interior prepared positions and waited. He had set a killing ground, and he had set it with the patience of a man who had done this before on the Eastern Front, where the distances were larger and the stakes even higher. Let the Americans enter the city, then close the door. He had no idea what 4 months of Patton's training looked like when the door closed on the wrong side. Part 2. The Trap SPRINGS. The boats reached the far bank at 4:51. 16 rubber assault craft, each carrying 12 men. The crossing took 11 minutes in water cold enough that men who shipped their paddles reported losing feeling in their hands before touching the eastern shore. Lieutenant Ray Prescott, 23, from Portland, Oregon, commanding 1st Platoon, stepped off the laid boat first. Before the war, he had hunted whitetail in the Cascade foothills, and the habit of reading terrain, of noticing what wasn't there as much as what was, had followed him into combat. What he noticed now was not the silence, though the silence was wrong for a city garrison that should have had sentries near a crossing point. What he noticed was a smell, motor oil, and something sharper beneath it, cordite, recent. He motioned his men forward and said nothing. The first 3 blocks proceeded exactly as planned. Empty streets, shuttered buildings, overturned carts. Webb on point, signaling back continuously, clear, Fitz carrying the radio on his back, antenna down to reduce the silhouette. Malone counting cross streets, 1, 2, at the 3rd intersection. Webb stopped. He came back to Malone at a crouch. The map showed this intersection opening onto a straight avenue, 400 yards, clear approach directly to the rail depot. What Webb had found instead, the avenue was barricaded, not hastily, deliberately. Interlocking concrete sections reinforced with timber I-beams, with narrow channels cut at knee height. Firing positions, interlocked fields of fire. The unobserved crossing point Marcel had described delivered Baker Company into the mouth of a designed killing ground. "Captain," Webb said, he didn't need to say anything else. The MG-42 fire came from 3 directions simultaneously at 5:17. The first burst from a second-floor window on the northern side of the avenue. The gun's rate of fire so high American soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw, 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound like tearing canvas at tremendous speed. The second burst from the barricade itself. The third from behind from a building Baker Company had already passed, positioned to trigger only after the Americans were fully inside, fully committed, fully cut off. Private Henry Oakes, 19, from Memphis, Tennessee, was killed in the opening seconds. So was Sergeant Marcus Delaney, 27, from Cincinnati, a man with a wife named Ruth and an infant son named Thomas who would grow up knowing his father only from photographs and the words of men who had survived the same alley. Malone hit the ground. The world compressed to sound and light and the specific physical sensation of concrete beneath his hands. When the first pause in fire came, 3 seconds, a magazine change somewhere, he moved. Caruso and Webb and 16 other men made it into a side alley. The rest of the company was split across the intersection, pinned in doorways, returning fire but unable to advance or retreat, wounded accumulating in the frozen rubble. Fitz got a transmission out at 5:23. The response from battalion, hold position, reinforcements being organized, estimated time of arrival unknown. The tank support, Malone asked specifically, was delayed. The 735th Tank Battalion's lead elements had encountered a minefield on the approach route. No armor crossing for a minimum of 4 hours. Then at 5:31 the orders changed. XII Corps had received intelligence, accurate intelligence, this time that German armor was moving towards Saarlaufen from the northeast. The crossing point Baker Company had just used was now assessed as a potential German counterattack axis. Malone received orders to secure the crossing point, pull back his company and hold for new instructions. Read that carefully. Malone was being ordered to abandon the mission he was already dying for, withdraw through the ambush that had just killed Oakes and Delaney, and hold a riverbank against armor, with no anti-tank assets heavier than a bazooka, in an exposed position in the dark. He held the radio handset for 6 seconds without transmitting. Every option was wrong. Retreat meant recrossing the kill zone with MG-42 positions still active, suicidal at close range, in the open. Advancing meant pushing deeper into a fortified city with half his force pinned, no armor, and a garrison 3 times his strength positioned in terrain specifically designed to multiply that advantage. Staying meant dying by degrees as ammunition ran low and Schreiber's men reorganized. At that moment in his command post 2 blocks away, Lieutenant Vorman was drafting his preliminary report. American force engaged and contained. Estimated 60–70% casualties inflicted. Garrison confidence, high, mission proceeding as planned. Schreiber had already decided what he would write to describe Patton's approach. An amateur's assault, predictable, expensive. Malone, crouched in a Saarlaufen alley with his dead, his static radio and no good choices, made his decision. He didn't retreat, he didn't press the barricade. He did something that Schreiber, with all his Eastern Front experience, all his prepared positions, all his 600 men, had not included in any defensive plan. He stopped, and he looked. A like on this video costs you 2 seconds. For the men of Baker Company who had no good options that morning, it costs you nothing. Part 3. The Patton Principle. George Patton had a saying he drilled into his Third Army officers with the consistency of a man who understood that panic under pressure is the default human response, and that the only way to defeat a default response is to replace it with something automatic. If a plan doesn't survive first contact, Patton told his assembled officers at Knutsford, England in July 1944, then the officer who cannot make a new one on the spot is not worth the uniform he is wearing. Your enemy has planned for your plan. He has not planned for your mind. Think about what that means. Patton was not advocating improvisation as a last resort. He was advocating it as the primary weapon. His entire doctrine for Third Army officer development revolved around what military historians now call second-order battlefield reading, the capacity in the worst possible moment to look at what the enemy has done and use it to identify precisely what the enemy has not done. Apply that to the alley in Saarlaufen. What had Schreiber done? Prepared an ambush. Barricades covering the northeastern avenue to the depot, machine gun positions in the buildings flanking that approach, a triggered trap that allowed Baker Company to enter deeply before springing, all of it oriented in one direction, northeast. Schreiber had massed his firepower, his prepared fortifications, and his tactical energy along the single axis he expected the Americans to advance. What had Schreiber not done? Malone spread his map on the alley floor, not to find where he was supposed to go, but to read what the city's layout told him about what Schreiber had assumed. 3 blocks south of the rail depot, the map showed the Saarlorton Municipal Water Treatment Facility, a low-profile industrial complex built partially underground, connected by a maintenance tunnel system to the city's industrial district. The tunnels were civil infrastructure, utility corridors that an infantry garrison commander planning to defeat a frontal American assault would not prioritize as a defensive position. They were also, if the German city engineering maps that Webb had retrieved from an abandoned civil defense office 3 streets back were accurate, connected by a service passage to a basement loading dock. On the south side of the rail depot, the back door. The door Schreiber had not locked because he had never imagined Americans in crisis would stop to look for it. This was the Patton principle in its most essential form. The obstacle was not a wall, it was information. The barricade, the ambush, the impossible numbers, all of it was Schreiber's signature. It told Malone exactly what Schreiber had been thinking. And what Schreiber had been thinking pointed like an arrow at what Schreiber had forgotten to think about. But the tunnel system ran beneath the residential quarter of Saarlorton. And the residential quarter was not empty. Malone sent Webb ahead to verify what he suspected. What Webb found, a 3-story apartment building above the tunnel access point, with 14 civilians sheltering inside, a family of 5, 2 elderly couples, 3 young women with small children, and a Catholic priest who had refused to abandon his congregation regardless of the tactical situation overhead. Here was the choice that no field manual had adequately prepared any officer for. Moving through the tunnel with those civilians directly above the planned emergence point risked their lives when the firefight ignited, but transmitting their location on the radio, requesting civilian evacuation support, would broadcast the exact route Malone intended to use. Schreiber was monitoring American frequencies. The plan would die in transmission before Baker Company moved 10 feet. Malone went to the building himself. Father Adalbert Kirsch, 67 years old, who had been leading a frightened congregation through hard seasons for 30 years, understood enough broken English and enough of Malone's gestures to understand what was needed. He moved those 14 people himself, quietly on foot without panic, to the church 3 blocks west, below Schreiber's defensive perimeter, clear of the coming line of fire. In the 18 minutes Malone needed to reorganize his force and reach the tunnel entrance. He did it without being asked. Without orders from anyone, on the judgment of a man who had spent a lifetime reading a room and responding to what it required. Patton, had he been there, would have recognized the principle immediately. It worked at every level of command. If this story has stayed with you, if the decisions these men made in a Saarlorton alley in December 1944 matter to you, the channel that brings you stories like this needs your subscription to keep going. Hit that button, we're not done yet. Part 4, The Breaking Point. 6-12 hours, 40 men, 2 bazookas, less than 40% ammunition load on every rifle in the unit, 3 wounded who could move under their own power, 1 dead carried by 2 living because Malone had refused quietly and absolutely to leave him in a foreign alley. The tunnel entrance was a rusted iron hatch set into a concrete recess behind the water treatment facility's northern wall. Webb had it open in 40 seconds with a pry bar. The space below was barely wide enough for a man with a pack. The tunnel smelled of iron and standing water and something older that no one wanted to name. No lights, single file. Malone sent Webb first, then Caruso with 6 men, then the rest, moving in silence, feeling the walls with their hands, with only the thin grey light of a December dawn filtering through iron grates overhead. The plan: emerge at the loading dock on the rail depot's south side. Neutralize whatever was there before the garrison understood the threat was already inside their perimeter. Then, and this was the piece that required everything Patton had trained into his officers, signal the pinned element of Baker Company still at the intersection to advance into the main gate. Schreiber's force, suddenly struck from two directions at once, would face a choice no fortified garrison can solve: hold the primary defensive positions against frontal pressure, or redeploy to face the threat emerging from behind. In an urban defense built around a single axis of advance, you cannot do both simultaneously. The problem arrived 60 seconds before the tunnel ended. Voices, German, close, then light, powerful electric light flooding down through a grate directly above the tunnel corridor. A generator lamp, the kind field units used when establishing temporary headquarters in forward positions. Schreiber, calculating that desperate Americans might attempt movement through the city's underground utility infrastructure, had posted a 6-man security detail in the maintenance corridor above the tunnel's exit point. Not at the exit, above it, watching the grate. If Baker Company emerged where they intended to emerge, they would surface directly under 6 German rifles waiting for exactly that. Webb came back to Malone in the dark. No words, 6 fingers, then a point upward. Malone looked at the ceiling, at the grate, at the light bleeding through it, at the 20 feet of tunnel remaining between his position and the loading dock exit. If they went forward, they surfaced into a firing position. If they stayed, they were entombed underground when Schreiber's main garrison noticed the silence from the alley and began to look. 15 minutes. Malone's estimate of the window before Schreiber's absence of contact from the alley triggered a search. Short sentences, short choices. This is what that kind of moment felt like for every man who has ever been in one. Malone pulled Caruso close, pointed at the grate, 6 fingers, then pointed to himself and 4 others, forward. Then pointed at Caruso and the rest, pushing motion, toward the loading dock exit around the security position, fast and without sound. Caruso looked at him for exactly 1 second, then he nodded. What happened next took 4 seconds. Malone and 4 men drove the grate upward with their shoulders and came through firing. The German security detail, 6 men with cigarettes, mid-conversation about a card game, had 3 seconds from the sound of the grate to the contact. 3 seconds is not enough time. 4 were down before they returned fire. 2 ran for the door, 1 made it. The alarm went up at 6:38, 7 minutes before Malone had estimated. Caruso's element hit the loading dock simultaneously. 2 German sentries. Webb had 19 seconds and a combat knife and the kind of absolute clarity about necessity that comes only to men who have been in exactly this situation before and know there is no other way through. The dock was clear. The south side of the rail depot opened into a loading bay with a direct sightline to the main interior, a space of iron girders and concrete freight platforms the size of a small cathedral. In that space, the heart of Schreiber's defense, ammunition stores, a field medical station. The command post itself, Vorman at a field telephone, already shouting into the receiver because the alarm had reached him and he did not yet understand from which direction. Between Baker Company and all of it, 63 German soldiers in defensive positions, oriented north and east, toward the barricade, toward the intersection, toward the approach Schreiber had planned for, prepared for, and waited for, not south, not from the direction no one was supposed to come from. 14 seconds before those 63 men fully reoriented. Malone used 12 of them. Baker Company came through the loading bay at a dead run, firing as they moved, Caruso on the left, Webb breaking right toward the ammunition stores, Malone straight at the command post, because Patton had written it explicitly in the operational principles that every Third Army officer was required to commit to memory: destroy the head, the body dies with it. The next 4 minutes were the most violent 4 minutes of James Malone's war, and he had been in this war for 16 months across 4 countries. Staff Sergeant Dominic Caruso was hit in the left shoulder at 6:41, a rifle round that spun him sideways and did not drop him. He switched his rifle to his right hand and kept moving. I found out later I'd been shot, Caruso wrote in a 1947 letter to his mother, later donated to the 90th Infantry Division archives by the Caruso family. At the time I only knew my arm wasn't working right. There wasn't time for it to hurt. Sit with those words for a moment. A man who did not know he had been shot. That is what a human being is capable of when the moment demands it of them. At 6:43, Lieutenant Vorman attempted to relay to Schreiber that the depot had been breached from the south. The transmission was interrupted when Luther Webb of Selma, Alabama, reached the field telephone cable and ripped it from the wall. Schreiber, at the Avenue barricade, lost contact with his command post and immediately understood what had happened. He ordered an immediate redeployment. 4 machine gun teams pulled from the barricade, redirected south. The barricade suddenly weakened. The 43 surviving men of Baker Company's pinned element, still at the intersection, Sergeant Frank Paulson of Duluth, Minnesota, commanding after the 2 officers above him had been wounded, had been crouched in frozen Sarlorton doorways for 1 hour and 28 minutes. They had watched 2 men die. They had listened to a radio that kept issuing orders to hold, hold, hold. They had been running the arithmetic on their ammunition and arriving at numbers with no good solution. When the sound of Baker Company's firefight reached them from the south, the unmistakable acoustic signature of a battle suddenly behind the enemy's main position, Paulson did not wait for orders. He attacked. The barricade fell at 6:51. The rail depot was secured by 7:04. Schreiber, attempting to withdraw north with approximately 80 surviving men, was cut off by elements of the 357th 1st Battalion, which had received Malone's radio signal at 6:39 and moved immediately to seal the northern exits. Schreiber surrendered at 7:22. He was carrying in his coat pocket the after-action assessment he had been drafting in the 45 minutes before the battle ended, the assessment he had begun writing when he still believed he was winning. The objective was secured, 4 days ahead of the projected operational timeline. Baker Company's total casualties, 22 men, including the dead from the initial ambush, 4 more lost during the tunnel operation, and 16 wounded of varying severity, including Caruso. Of the 40 men who went through the tunnel, 31 walked out of the Sarlorton rail depot under their own power. Victory, look at what it cost. Part 5, the verdict. The Sarlorton rail depot on the morning of December 8, 1944, looked like the inside of something broken in a way that couldn't be entirely put back. Not dramatic ruin. Worse than that, the specific, unglamorous wreckage of a space where men had fought and bled across concrete floors, shell casings, a German field telephone cable on the ground, ripped from the wall and coiled where Luther Webb had left it, medical supplies scattered when the aid station became a battlefield. Somewhere outside, persistent and indifferent, the sound of the Saar River moving over its banks, Malone sat on a concrete freight platform near the loading bay and looked at the photograph of Elena for the first time since 200 that morning. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't say anything that anyone recorded. He was 28 years old, sitting in a captured German train depot in a foreign country in December, looking at the face of a daughter he had never held, in light that was grey and cold and real. Among the materials seized at Sarlorton was Schreiber's command file, including the documents found in his coat pocket and the garrison's Army Group G intelligence summary, the one containing Balk's assessment of Patton as a glory hunter who sacrifices his men for newspaper headlines. Schreiber's own draft assessment told a different story. Begun when he still believed he was winning, completed in a post-war prisoner of war statement filed with American military historians in 1946, it read in part, "The American assault from the southern position was not predictable from our defensive preparations. The force was small, the ammunition clearly depleted. Movement through the maintenance infrastructure in those conditions was extreme. What cannot be explained is the speed of decision-making under those conditions. Our garrison had been prepared for the American commander to behave as his commander's reputation described. to force the primary axis of attack regardless of cost, because that is what a commander who requires results quickly for public reasons would do. This commander did not behave that way. He stopped, he looked, he found the one thing we had not prepared for. I do not know where this kind of officer comes from, we had not expected it. Read those words from the man who laughed when he heard the Americans were crossing. General Balk's Army Group G Post-Action Summary, filed December 14, 1944, acknowledged that the loss of Saarlorten had opened a gap in the West Wall requiring immediate defensive reallocation across a 30-mile front. It did not mention Patton by name. But the 357th Infantry Regiment's operational record noted that intercepted German communications in the days following the battle began referring to XII Corps as Die Flexiblen Amerikaner, the flexible Americans. In German operational vocabulary, that phrase carries specific weight. It means they do not behave as predicted. They are dangerous in the way water is dangerous. They find the openings you did not know you had left. Patton received the action report for Saarlorten on December 9, 1944 at 3rd Army Headquarters in Nancy, France. His diary entry for that day, now held in the Library of Congress Manuscript Division, recorded, Baker Company 357th, good work, exactly the kind of thinking I have been demanding. Officers must not be slaves to plans. Plans are tools. When the tool breaks, the officer must still build the house. The lesson of Saarlorten is not complicated, but it is rare because it demands the opposite of what instinct commands when everything is collapsing around you. When the plan fails, when the intelligence was wrong, when the enemy is stronger than anyone said, and you are standing in an alley in a foreign city with your dead and half your ammunition, every human instinct pushes toward forcing the original plan harder. Because stopping feels like failure. And adapting feels like admitting you were wrong, which in the middle of a firefight feels like the one luxury you cannot afford. Patton's principle said otherwise. Stop, look at what went wrong. The obstacle is not an obstacle, it is a message from your enemy about what they were thinking. And what they were thinking tells you with precision what they forgot to think about. Move there, move fast. Move before they realize they forgot. Malone did not win because he was reckless. He did not win because Patton had made him invincible. He won because, in the worst moment, he got quiet enough inside to listen to what the situation was telling him, and then moved, without hesitation, toward the answer that no one had expected. Sergeant Dominic Caruso received treatment at a field station outside Saarlorten and returned to duty 11 days later. He survived the war, went back to Brooklyn, opened a hardware store on Flatbush Avenue, and raised 3 children. He died in 1991. His Silver Star, awarded for the action at Saarlorten on December 4 through 8, 1944, is displayed at the 90th Infantry Division Museum in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, alongside a photograph of the Saar River taken from the eastern bank in winter light that looks exactly like the morning Baker Company crossed it. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the European theater, 3rd Army, XII Corps, the 90th Division, or any unit that pushed through the West Wall that winter, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit, what campaign, where did they end up? Those stories live in family memory and nowhere else. They deserve to be spoken aloud. The Saarlorten rail depot is still standing. The city is called Saarlouis today. The maintenance tunnel access point, the rusted iron hatch in the concrete recess behind the water treatment facility's northern wall, was documented in a 1987 historical survey of the city's civil infrastructure. It is still there, covered now, unremarkable. Set into the ground of a modern city that has largely forgotten what passed through it on a December morning 8 decades ago, most things that matter do not announce themselves.